Friend, pull up a chair and settle in close. What I'm about to tell you happened in the autumn of 1883 in a place called Cedar Bend, Wyoming Territory. Now, I know what you're thinking. Another tale about the Old West, about cowboys and cattle and wide open spaces. But this one's different. It's about the kind of courage that doesn't come with a gun or a badge. It's about the quiet kind, the sort that keeps a woman standing tall when the whole world's telling her to break. You see, back in those days, a woman alone was about as welcome as a snake in a Sunday school.
I've waited for this moment.
Didn't matter if she could work harder than most men. Didn't matter if she had more grit than a gravel road. What mattered was that she had a man's name to stand behind, or she had nothing at all. This is the story of a woman who arrived in Cedar Bend with nothing. And I do mean nothing. No husband waiting at the station, no family to claim her, no place to lay her head come nightfall. Just a worn carpet bag, 62 cents in her pocket, and a piece of paper that turned out to be worth less than the ink it was printed on. But here's the thing about rock bottom, friend. Sometimes that's exactly where the Lord puts you, so you can see what you're really made of. Now let me tell you about Abigail Winters. The 317 from Cheyenne pulled into Cedar Bend 43 minutes late on a Thursday afternoon. The platform was nothing more than weathered planks and a roof that sagged in the middle like an old horse's back. Dust hung in the air, thick and golden in the slanting September light, and the smell of coal smoke mixed with sage and distant rain. Abigail stepped down from the passenger car, her boots finding the platform with a soft thud that seemed too loud in the sudden quiet. The train had been full of noise, full of people and their chatter, their plans, their certainties. Now there was only the hiss of the engine cooling and the distant call of a crow somewhere beyond the station. She stood there, carpetbag in hand, and waited. Around her, other passengers moved with purpose. A man in a suit climbed into a waiting buggy. A woman with 2 children was met by a weathered cowboy who swept the youngest child into his arms with a laugh that carried across the platform. An elderly couple walked slowly toward the street, leaning on each other like 2 trees grown together over time. Abigail waited. The paper in her pocket felt like it was burning through the fabric of her traveling dress. She'd read it so many times on the journey west that she could recite every word without looking. The marriage certificate signed and sealed, with her name written in careful script on one line and Charles Henderson's bold signature on the other. The promise in writing that she was coming to Wyoming as a bride, that a man was waiting for her, that her life was about to begin. She'd been so careful with that paper. Kept it wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the rain in Pennsylvania, from the soot and grime of the train. Held it close to her chest at night in the cheap hotels where she'd stopped between connections, as if the weight of it against her heart could make it more real. The platform cleared. The train shuddered, belched steam, and began its slow pull away from the station. The sound of it faded into the distance until all that was left was the wind moving through the cottonwoods along the creek and the creak of the station sign swinging on its chains. Abigail waited. 45 minutes she stood there, long enough for the sun to slide lower in the sky, long enough for the shadow of the water tower to stretch across the platform like a pointing finger, long enough for her back to ache and her feet to go numb in her good boots, long enough to know, deep in the place where hope lives and dies, that no one was coming. The station master finally approached. He was a short man with a belly that strained the buttons of his vest and a face red from too much sun or too much whiskey or both. His eyes, when they met hers, held a mixture of pity and impatience. "Miss," he said, and even that one word sounded like an apology. "Miss, I got to close up." "You expecting someone?" Abigail's throat was dry. She'd finished the last of her water an hour outside of Cheyenne. "Charles Henderson," she said, and her voice came out steady. Thank the Lord for that small mercy. "He was supposed to meet me here." The station master pulled off his cap, scratched at his thinning hair. "Henderson, you say? Charles Henderson?" "Yes, sir." He shook his head slowly, the way a man does when he's about to deliver bad news and wishes he didn't have to. "Miss, there ain't nobody by that name in Cedar Bend. Ain't never been, far as I know, and I've been here 12 years come December." The world tilted slightly, like the platform had turned to water under her feet. Abigail gripped her carpetbag tighter, felt the handles dig into her palm. There must be some mistake. He wrote to me. For 6 months we corresponded. He sent me money for the ticket. How much money? The station master's voice had gone gentle now, the kind of gentle that's worse than harshness, because it means the person knows you've been played for a fool. $40. He winced. "Miss, I'm real sorry, but I think you've been swindled. There's men out there, they put advertisements in Eastern papers, they write pretty letters and make pretty promises, and they take money from women looking for a fresh start out west. Then them women arrive and find out there ain't no husband, ain't no farm, ain't nothing but an empty platform and a town full of strangers." Abigail heard the words, understood them on some level that didn't require thinking, but her body wouldn't quite believe it yet. Her hand moved to her pocket, pulled out the marriage certificate, unfolded it with fingers that trembled just slightly. "But I have this. It's legal. It's signed." The station master glanced at the paper, wouldn't meet her eyes. "Yes, ma'am. I expect it is signed. By someone. But I'm telling you true, there ain't no Charles Henderson in Cedar Bend. Never has been." From behind them came the sound of footsteps, the rustle of skirts. Abigail turned to see 2 women standing near the station entrance, both dressed in the kind of clothes that spoke of comfortable lives and husbands who provided well. One was tall and thin, with a face like a hatchet. The other was shorter, rounder, with eyes that darted everywhere like a bird looking for crumbs. "Another one," the tall woman said, not bothering to lower her voice. "That's the 3rd this year, Martha. These mail-order swindlers are getting bolder." The shorter woman, Martha, clucked her tongue. "Shameful, just shameful. These girls come all this way thinking they're going to be wives, and instead they end up, well." She let the sentence hang there, heavy with implication. The station master cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Ladies, if you'll excuse us." But Martha wasn't finished. She took a step closer, her eyes moving over Abigail like she was inspecting a horse at auction. "Where are you from, girl?" "Pennsylvania." Abigail's voice came out flat now, stripped of everything but the basic facts. "Allentown. Long way to come for nothing." Martha shook her head. "What will you do now?" It was the question Abigail had been avoiding asking herself for the last 45 minutes. What would she do? She had 62 cents, no family within 2,000 miles, no friends in this territory, no husband, despite the worthless paper in her hand. She could use some of her remaining money to send a telegram back east, begging for help that probably wouldn't come. Could try to earn enough for a ticket back to Pennsylvania, back to the textile mill where she'd worked 12-hour days for wages that barely kept body and soul together. Could throw herself on the mercy of these women who were looking at her like she was something they'd scrape off their shoes. Or she could do what she'd been doing since her father died 7 years ago. She could stand straight, put one foot in front of the other, and survive. "I'll manage," Abigail said. She folded the marriage certificate, creased it small and tight, and pushed it deep into her pocket where she wouldn't have to look at it anymore. "Thank you for your time, sir." She picked up her carpetbag, adjusted her shawl, and walked past the 2 women without another glance. Her boots rang out on the platform, then went quiet as she stepped down onto the dusty street of Cedar Bend, Wyoming Territory. Behind her she heard Martha's voice, sharp and carrying. "Bold as brass, that one. Mark my words, she'll come to a bad end." Abigail kept walking. Cedar Bend wasn't much to look at. One main street of packed dirt, lined on both sides with false front buildings that had seen better days. A general store with windows that needed washing, a saloon with bat-wing doors, and the tinny sound of a piano drifting out into the afternoon. A church with a white steeple that leaned slightly to the left. A livery stable at the far end of town, and beyond that, the open country that stretched all the way to the mountains, purple and distant against the sky. Abigail walked the length of the street twice, getting the lay of the land, seeing who saw her and what their faces said. A few cowboys lounged outside the saloon, their eyes tracking her progress with mild interest. An old man sat on a bench in front of the general store, whittling something that might have been a bird or might have been nothing at all. A woman swept the steps of what looked like a boarding house, her movements mechanical, her face hard with the kind of exhaustion that comes from years of work that never ends. By the time the sun touched the tops of the mountains, turning the sky the color of hammered copper, Abigail had made her decisions. She had 62 cents. She needed a place to sleep, and she needed work. The boarding house was called Hargrove's. The sign above the door was hand-painted, the letters faded but still legible. Abigail climbed the steps, knocked on the doorframe. The woman with the broom looked up. She was perhaps 50, with gray streaking through dark hair pulled back in a severe bun. Lines bracketed her mouth, but her eyes, when they met Abigail's, weren't unkind. "Help you?" "I'm looking for a room, ma'am, just for tonight." Abigail paused, calculated. "And I'm looking for work, any kind of work. I can clean, cook, mend, tend the sick, whatever needs doing." The woman leaned on her broom, studying Abigail the way the station master had studied her marriage certificate, looking for the truth underneath the surface. "You're the girl from the train, the one whose man didn't show." It wasn't a question. News traveled fast in small towns. Abigail met the woman's gaze straight on. "Yes, ma'am." "Got any money?" "Some." "How much is some?" There was no point in lying. 62 cents. The woman's eyebrows went up. "That's not enough for a room, not even close." "No, ma'am, but it's what I have." Abigail shifted her carpet bag to her other hand. "I was hoping we could work out an arrangement. I'll pay what I can and work off the rest. I'm strong, and I'm not afraid of hard work." For a long moment the woman said nothing. Then she sighed, the kind of sigh that said she was probably going to regret this, but was going to do it anyway. "Name's Violet Hargrove. This is my place. I got a storage room out back of the kitchen, barely big enough to turn around in, but it's got a cot and it's dry. You can have it for tonight for 10 cents. Tomorrow, we'll talk about work." 10 cents. That would leave her with 52 cents. Enough for maybe 2 more nights if Mrs. Hargrove kept the price the same. After that, Abigail would need to have found work, or she'd be sleeping under the stars. "Thank you, ma'am. I'm grateful." Mrs. Hargrove waved a hand dismissively. "Don't thank me yet. You might not feel grateful once you see the room." She turned toward the door, then paused. "You had supper?" Abigail's stomach had been empty since noon, but she shook her head. Food would cost money she couldn't spare. "I'm fine, ma'am." Mrs. Hargrove made a sound that might have been disapproval or might have been understanding. "There's leftover stew in the kitchen. Not much, but you're welcome to it. No charge for the scraps nobody else wanted." Something hot and tight formed behind Abigail's eyes, but she blinked it away before it could turn into tears. She hadn't cried when her father died, hadn't cried through 7 years of mill work, hadn't cried on the platform when the truth finally sank in. She wasn't about to start now. "Thank you," she said again, and followed Mrs. Hargrove into the boarding house. The storage room was exactly as advertised, barely big enough to turn around in, with a narrow cot pushed against one wall and a crate that served as a table. But the cot had a blanket that looked clean, and there was a small window that let in the last of the evening light. And when Abigail sat down on the thin mattress, she felt something in her chest loosen just slightly. She had a roof over her head. For tonight, at least, she was safe. Mrs. Hargrove brought her a bowl of stew, thin and mostly broth, but with a few chunks of potato and carrot floating in it, and half a biscuit that had gone hard around the edges. Abigail ate slowly, making it last, tasting each bite like it was a feast instead of scraps. When she was finished, she set the bowl aside and opened her carpet bag for the first time since leaving Pennsylvania. Everything she owned in the world was in that bag. 2 dresses, both worn but mended with careful stitches, a change of underclothes, her mother's Bible, the pages soft from years of reading, a small cloth pouch that held her sewing kit, needles and thread wound tight, And at the very bottom, wrapped in a square of linen, a glass jar no bigger than her palm. Abigail lifted the jar carefully, held it up to the fading light. Inside were dried herbs, crushed and mixed, according to her grandmother's recipe. Feverfew for headaches and inflammation. Yarrow for fever and wounds, comfrey for bruises and broken bones. Her grandmother had been a midwife back in Pennsylvania, had taught Abigail everything she knew about healing before she died. These herbs were worth more than money in their way. They were knowledge, skill, power. She set the jar on the crate next to the empty bowl. Tomorrow she would ask Mrs. Hargrove about work, and if there was no work in town, she would go beyond it. She knew how to forage, how to identify plants that could heal and plants that could kill. The land around Cedar Bend looked wild, untamed. There would be herbs growing along the creeks and in the meadows. She could gather them, dry them, sell them to whoever needed them. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was something, and something was more than nothing. Abigail lay down on the narrow cot, still fully dressed, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. Through the small window, she could see stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky, cold and bright, and impossibly far away. Somewhere in Pennsylvania, her few remaining acquaintances probably thought she was settling into her new life as a rancher's wife. Somewhere in Cedar Bend, people were probably still gossiping about the foolish girl who'd been taken in by a mail-order swindle. And somewhere, a man named Charles Henderson, if that was even his real name, was probably laughing about the $40 he'd stolen from a woman desperate enough to believe in his promises. Abigail closed her eyes. Tomorrow would come whether she was ready for it or not. She might as well rest while she could. The first week in Cedar Bend passed in a blur of backbreaking work, and nights so exhausted that Abigail fell asleep before her head hit the thin pillow. Mrs. Hargrove, true to her word, found work for her. Washing bed linens for the boarding house, scrubbing floors for the saloon, arriving before dawn so she wouldn't be there when the customers started drinking, mending shirts for cowboys who paid her 10 or 15 cents per garment, depending on how bad the damage was. She made enough to pay for her room, barely. On good days, she had enough left over for a meal. On bad days, she went to bed with her stomach growling and her hands cracked and bleeding from the harsh lye soap she used for washing. But she kept her spine straight. That's what her father used to say. Abby girl, you can take away everything from a person except their dignity, and that's only gone if they give it away themselves. So Abigail kept her spine straight. She nodded politely to the women who whispered behind their hands when she passed. She ignored the looks from men who saw a woman alone and thought she might be available for other kinds of work. She showed up when she said she would, did the job she was hired to do, and asked for nothing she hadn't earned. On the 8th morning, she woke before dawn as usual and made her way out of town toward Broken Creek. Mrs. Hargrove had mentioned that the apothecary in the next town over would pay good money for certain herbs, especially this time of year when people were starting to prepare for winter ailments. Feverfew grew along creek banks, Mrs. Hargrove said. Yarrow liked open meadows. Abigail had spent her last few pennies on a canvas sack for gathering. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. The walk to Broken Creek took the better part of an hour. The sun was just beginning to lighten the eastern sky, turning it from black to deep purple to a pale, fragile blue. The air was cold enough that Abigail's breath came out in small clouds and frost sparkled on the grass like scattered diamonds. The creek, when she found it, was everything Mrs. Hargrove had promised. Clear water running over smooth stones, cottonwoods lining the banks with leaves turned gold by the autumn weather. And there, growing in thick clusters along the water's edge, exactly what she'd been hoping for. Feverfew, its white flowers just starting to fade. Yarrow, tall and tough with flat-topped clusters of tiny blooms. Abigail knelt by the water and began to harvest, her hands moving with the confidence born of years of practice. Her grandmother's voice came back to her, patient and sure. Never take more than a third from any one plant, Abigail. Leave enough that it can grow back, provide for the next person who needs it. The sun climbed higher. The frost melted. Birds called to each other in the trees, and somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed. Abigail's canvas sack slowly filled with herbs that would dry into medicine, into hope, into the means of keeping a roof over her head for another few days. She was so focused on her work that she almost didn't see the horse. It was the sound that caught her attention first. Not the thunder of hooves, but something quieter. A soft snort, the jingle of tack, the creak of leather. Abigail looked up, her hands still full of yarrow stems, and saw the mare standing in the shallows about 20 feet upstream. She was beautiful. Black as midnight, with a white star on her forehead that caught the morning light. Her coat gleamed like polished obsidian, and the saddle on her back was worked leather with silver conchos that probably cost more than Abigail had made in the past year. But there was no rider. Abigail's father had been a blacksmith, had worked with horses all his life, and he'd taught Abigail one truth that she'd never forgotten. A riderless horse meant trouble. Either the rider had dismounted by choice, or the rider was hurt, or the rider was dead. The smart thing to do would be to collect her herbs and head back to town. Let someone else deal with whatever had happened here. Let someone else take the risk. But Abigail had never been particularly good at doing the smart thing when someone might need help. She set down her gathering sack, stood slowly so she wouldn't spook the mare, and began to move upstream, her eyes scanning the creek bank. The grass was bent in places, showing where something heavy had pushed through. Broken twigs hung from the willow branches, and there, caught on a rock in the middle of the creek, a man's hat, the crown dented and water-stained. Abigail's heart began to beat faster. She found him 10 feet further up the creek, lying face down at the water's edge with one arm stretched toward the water like he'd been trying to reach it and hadn't quite made it. His coat was good wool, his boots were expensive leather, and the back of his head was matted with blood that had dried to a dark, rusty brown. For one terrible moment, Abigail thought he was dead. Then she saw his back move just slightly. A breath, shallow and pained, but a breath. She dropped to her knees beside him, her hands moving to his shoulder, rolling him carefully onto his back. His face was pale beneath a layer of trail dust, his lips cracked and dry. He was older than she'd expected, 35, maybe 40, dark hair going gray at the temples, lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into the sun, a strong jaw covered with several days' worth of stubble. And his eyes, when they fluttered open for just a moment, were the color of good whiskey, amber and gold and brown, all mixed together. "Sir," Abigail said, keeping her voice calm, even though her pulse was racing. "Sir, can you hear me?" His eyes tried to focus on her face, couldn't quite manage it. His lips moved, but no sound came out except a faint groan. Abigail's hands went to the back of his head, felt through his hair until she found the source of the blood. A gash, maybe 3 inches long, where he'd struck something hard. The skull beneath felt intact, thank God for small mercies, but the wound was deep enough that it had bled freely. Head wounds always looked worse than they were, her grandmother used to say, but they were nothing to take lightly either. She needed to get him conscious, needed to get him somewhere safe, needed to clean that wound before infection set in. But first, she needed to know if he could move, if anything was broken, if internal injuries were going to kill him before she could get help. "Sir," she said again, louder this time, "I need you to wake up. I need you to tell me where you're hurt." His eyes opened again, and this time they stayed open. He stared at her for a long moment, his expression confused, like he couldn't quite figure out where he was or why a strange woman was kneeling beside him with her hands on his face. "Who?" His voice came out as a rasp, barely audible over the sound of the creek. "Who are you? My name is Abigail Winters. I found you here by the creek. You've been hurt. Can you tell me what happened?" He blinked slowly, his eyes moving past her to the sky, to the trees, trying to piece together a story his brain couldn't quite access. "Mountain lion," he said finally. "Spooked Sable. I fell." Sable. The black mare. That made sense. "Can you move?" Abigail asked. "Fingers, toes?" He tried. She watched his hands clench into fists, saw his boots shift in the dirt. Everything seemed to work, at least on a basic level. No paralysis then, no broken spine. I think I can sit up. Let me help you." Abigail got her arm under his shoulders, took most of his weight as he struggled into a sitting position. He swayed dangerously, and she had to brace herself to keep him from toppling sideways back into the dirt. Up close, she could smell horse and sweat and blood. And underneath it all, something clean. Soap, maybe, or just the scent of a man who took care of himself. "Easy," she murmured. "Take your time. You've lost some blood." He raised one hand to the back of his head, winced when his fingers found the wound. When he brought his hand back around, his palm was smeared with red. He stared at it for a moment, then looked at Abigail with those whiskey-colored eyes. "You saved my life," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. "I found you, that's all. But we need to get you back to town. Get a doctor to look at that head. Can you ride?" "With help, maybe." Abigail looked at the mare, still standing patiently in the shallows. Looked at the man beside her, who was probably twice her weight and barely conscious. Looked at the distance between the creek and Cedar Bend, which had seemed like a pleasant morning walk an hour ago, and now seemed impossible. She could leave him here, go get help. But that would take time, and time was something they might not have. If he had a concussion, if he started bleeding again, if he slipped back into unconsciousness and couldn't wake up. No, the only option was to get him on that horse and get him to town, even if it took everything she had. "All right," Abigail said. She stood, brushed off her skirt, and held out both hands. "Take my hands. We're going to get you standing, then we're going to get you on Sable, and then we're going to get you somewhere safe. Can you do that?" For a moment he just looked at her hands. They were rough from work, the nails chipped, and the knuckles red from lye soap. Not the hands of a lady, but they were strong, and they were steady, and right now they were all he had. He reached up and took them. Getting him on the horse was an exercise in stubborn determination on both their parts. He was heavy and weak, and twice he nearly passed out from the pain and effort. But Abigail had hauled full water buckets up 3 flights of stairs in the boarding house, had lifted her father after he'd been kicked by a horse and couldn't stand on his own, had learned young that sometimes strength wasn't about muscle, it was about refusing to give up. She got him into the saddle, got the reins in his hands, got her own foot in the stirrup behind him, and pulled herself up, her skirts bunching awkwardly around her legs, propriety be damned. "Hold on," she said in his ear. "Just hold on. I'll get us back." His only response was a grunt that might have been agreement or might have been pain. Abigail wrapped one arm around his waist to keep him upright, took the reins in her other hand, and urged Sable into a walk. The journey back to Cedar Bend took twice as long as the walk out had. Abigail had to stop 3 times to let the man rest, to make sure he was still breathing, to wipe the fresh blood that seeped from his wound. By the time the buildings of town came into view, the sun was high overhead, and Abigail's entire body ached from the effort of keeping them both in the saddle. But they made it. People stared as they rode down the main street. Cowboys stopped what they were doing to watch. Women came out of the general store, their hands pressed to their mouths. And from the livery stable at the end of town, an old man came running, his face going white when he saw who was on the horse. "Boss!" The old man's voice cracked with fear and relief all mixed together. "Dear God, we've been looking for you since yesterday. Where—" He stopped when he saw Abigail, really saw her, saw the blood on her dress and her arms around the injured man. "He fell from his horse," Abigail said, her voice coming out steadier than she felt. "Hit his head. He needs a doctor." The old man was already reaching up, helping to ease the injured man down from the saddle. 2 younger cowboys appeared from inside the stable, their faces tight with concern, their hands gentle as they supported their boss between them. "Get him to the ranch," the old man barked. "Send someone for Doc Hammond, and for God's sake, be careful with him." They moved quickly, efficiently, like men who knew each other well and didn't need words to coordinate. Within minutes, the injured man was being loaded into a wagon, blankets tucked around him, one of the cowboys climbing up to drive. Abigail started to dismount, her legs shaking with exhaustion. The old man was suddenly there, his weathered hands helping her down, his eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her want to look away. "Miss," he said, "I don't know who you are, but you saved that man's life. That's Nathan Holloway you brought in. He owns the Broken Creek Ranch. Been gone since yesterday morning, and we was feared the worst. Nathan Holloway." The name meant nothing to Abigail, but the way the old man said it, with a mixture of respect and affection and relief, told her that it meant something to this town, meant something to these people. "I'm glad I could help," Abigail said. She was suddenly aware of how she must look. Dress covered in blood and creek water, hair falling out of its pins, face probably smudged with dirt. The old man was still staring at her. "He say anything to you on the ride back? Just that he fell, that a mountain lion spooked his horse." The old man's jaw tightened. "That cat's been causing trouble for weeks. Killed 3 calves last month." He seemed to shake himself, focused back on Abigail. "Where are you staying, miss? Boss is going to want to thank you proper once he's on his feet again." Abigail hesitated. "I'm at Hargrove's boarding house, for now." Something flickered in the old man's eyes, understanding, maybe, or pity. He'd probably heard about the girl at the train station, the one whose husband never showed. In a town this small, everyone knew everyone else's business. "Right," he said. "Well, miss, you just saved the life of the most important man in 3 counties. That means something. You need anything at all, you come find me at the Broken Creek. Name's Red Callahan. I'm the foreman there." "Thank you, Mr. Callahan. But I don't need anything. I was just glad I could help." She meant it. But Red Callahan was looking at her the way her grandmother used to look at her when she was being particularly stubborn, with a mixture of exasperation and fondness. "Nathan Holloway ain't the kind of man who forgets a debt," Red said quietly. "You remember that." Then he tipped his hat, climbed up onto the wagon beside the driver, and they were off, heading north out of town toward a ranch Abigail had never seen and probably never would. She stood there in the street, watching them go, until Mrs. Hargrove appeared at her elbow. "Abigail Winters," Mrs. Hargrove said, and there was something almost like approval in her voice. "You've had quite a morning." Abigail looked down at herself, at the blood drying on her dress, at her canvas sack of herbs abandoned somewhere by the creek. She'd need to go back for it, if she could find the spot again. Needed those herbs if she was going to make enough money to keep eating. But right now, all she wanted was to wash her face and sit down somewhere quiet and let her hands stop shaking. "Yes, ma'am," she said. "Quite a morning, Mrs." Hargrove steered her back toward the boarding house, one hand firm on Abigail's elbow. "Come on, girl, let's get you cleaned up. And then I think you'd better tell me everything that happened." So Abigail did. And 3 miles north of town, in the big house at the Broken Creek Ranch, Nathan Holloway opened his eyes long enough to say one thing to Red Callahan before sleep claimed him again. "The woman," he whispered. "Find out who she is." "Already know, boss. Name's Abigail Winters." Nathan's eyes closed, but his lips moved, forming words so quiet Red had to lean in close to hear them. "Abigail Winters. Don't let her leave town. Whatever she needs, make sure she has it." Then Nathan Holloway, the man who owned 8,000 acres and 1,200 head of cattle, the man who hadn't asked anyone for help in the 7 years since his wife died, let the darkness take him. And in the boarding house in Cedar Bend, Abigail Winters sat in her tiny storage room and wondered why saving a stranger's life felt like the first right thing she'd done since stepping off that train. She pulled the marriage certificate from her pocket, looked at it one more time. Charles Henderson's signature, bold and false. Her own name, written in hope that had turned to ash. She should burn it, throw it away, forget it ever existed. But she folded it carefully instead, tucked it into her Bible, and closed her eyes. Tomorrow would come. She would face it the way she'd faced everything else, with her spine straight and her hands ready to work. Whatever came next, she would survive it. She always had. Red Callahan arrived at Hargrove's boarding house the next morning just as the sun was breaking over the eastern mountains. He sat astride a sturdy buckskin gelding, and behind him, tied to a lead rope, was the black mare Sable, her coat gleaming in the early light like she'd been brushed until she shone. Abigail was already awake. She'd been awake since before dawn, standing at the small window of her storage room, watching the sky change from black to gray to the pale gold of sunrise. Sleep had been hard to come by. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Nathan Holloway's face, pale and blood-streaked, heard his voice, rough and desperate, felt the weight of him in her arms as she struggled to keep him upright in the saddle. She'd saved a man's life yesterday. A stranger. A man who owned more land than she could probably walk across in a week, who had people depending on him, who mattered in ways she would never matter. And now his foreman was here, sitting easy in the saddle, his weathered face unreadable in the morning light. Abigail stepped out onto the back porch, her shawl wrapped tight against the chill. Red saw her immediately, touched the brim of his hat in greeting. "Miss Winters," he said, "hope I didn't wake you." "You didn't. I was already up." She moved down the steps, her eyes going to Sable. "Is Mr. Holloway all right?" "Doc Hammond says he'll live. Got a concussion, needs rest, but he's too stubborn to stay in bed for long." Red's mouth quirked in something that might have been a smile. "He sent me to fetch you." Abigail's stomach did something strange, a flutter that had nothing to do with hunger. "Fetch me?" "To the ranch. Boss wants to thank you proper, and he's got a proposition for you." The word hung in the air between them. Proposition. Abigail had heard that word before, usually from men who thought a woman alone was fair game for all kinds of indecent suggestions. But Red Callahan's face held nothing but respect, and his eyes, when they met hers, were steady and honest. "What kind of proposition?" she asked carefully. "The kind that involves honest work for honest pay. He'll explain when you get there. But, Miss Winters, I'm going to tell you straight. Nathan Holloway is a good man. Best I've ever known. He don't take advantage. He don't lie. And when he says he owes someone a debt, he means to pay it." Abigail looked at the black mare, at the expensive saddle, at the morning spreading out before her like a gift she hadn't asked for. She could say no, could stay here in her storage room, scrubbing floors and mending shirts for pennies, slowly saving enough to, maybe, someday, have a different life. Or she could take a chance. Again. Even though the last time she'd taken a chance on a man's promises, she'd ended up stranded 2,000 miles from home with nothing but 62 cents and a worthless piece of paper. But Red Callahan wasn't promising her marriage. He was promising work. And work was something Abigail understood. "All right," she said, "let me get my things." The ride to Broken Creek Ranch took the better part of an hour. Red kept the pace easy, mindful of the fact that Abigail wasn't an experienced rider. She sat astride behind him on the buckskin, her hands gripping the saddle's cantle, her body stiff with the effort of staying balanced. The land opened up as they left town behind. Rolling hills covered in autumn grass, golden in the slanting light. Cottonwoods lining creeks that ran clear over beds of smooth stone. In the distance, mountains rose purple and majestic against a sky so blue it hurt to look at. It was beautiful. Abigail had seen beauty in Pennsylvania, in the green hills and the covered bridges and the farms that dotted the valleys. But this was different. This was vast and wild and so open it made her chest ache with something she couldn't name. Red didn't talk much during the ride, and Abigail was grateful for the silence. It gave her time to think, to prepare, to steel herself for whatever was coming. The ranch, when it finally came into view, took her breath away. The house was white, 2 stories tall, with a porch that wrapped around 3 sides like welcoming arms. Real glass windows caught the morning sun and threw it back at the sky. A red barn sat to the left, solid and proud, with corrals spreading out behind it like the spokes of a wheel. Beyond that, pastures rolled toward the horizon, dotted with cattle that moved slow and peaceful through the grass. This wasn't just a ranch. This was an empire, built by someone who knew how to work and how to dream and how to make both those things real. Red guided the buckskin up to the front porch, dismounted, and held out a hand to help Abigail down. Her legs were shaky when her feet hit the ground, whether from the ride or from nerves she couldn't quite say. The front door opened before they reached it. A woman stood there, perhaps 60 years old, with iron-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing. She wore a simple dress covered by a flour-dusted apron, and her hands were red and rough from years of work. "So you're the girl who saved Nathan's fool hide," the woman said. It wasn't quite a question, wasn't quite an accusation, just a statement of fact, delivered in a voice that had probably been giving orders for decades. "This is Mamie Holloway," Red said. "Nathan's aunt. She runs the house, and half the time she runs the rest of us, too." Mamie's lips twitched. "Don't you forget it." She stepped back, holding the door open. "Come in, child. You look like you could use some coffee and a decent meal." The inside of the house was as impressive as the outside. Polished wooden floors that gleamed like honey. A parlor with leather chairs and a fireplace big enough to stand in. Photographs on the walls, faces Abigail didn't recognize but could read stories in. A young man and woman on their wedding day, both of them serious and hopeful. The same man, older now, standing beside a horse with a hand on its neck, a child's drawing, framed like it was precious. Mamie led her through to the kitchen, and it was there that Abigail finally felt like she could breathe. This was a working kitchen, not a showpiece. A massive cast-iron stove dominated one wall, its surface covered with pots and pans that showed years of use. A table, scarred and sturdy, sat in the center of the room with chairs that didn't match but looked comfortable. Herbs hung from the ceiling beams, drying in bunches that filled the air with the scent of sage and thyme, and something sweet Abigail couldn't quite identify. "Sit," Mamie commanded, pointing to one of the chairs. "Red, go tell Nathan she's here, and tell him to stay in that bed until I say otherwise." Red grinned. "You tell him that yourself, Mamie. He don't listen to me. He don't listen to anybody." Mamie was already moving toward the stove, pouring coffee into a thick ceramic mug, setting it in front of Abigail with a thunk that made the table shake slightly. "But he's alive to not listen, and that's because of you." Abigail wrapped her hands around the mug, felt the warmth seep into her palms. The coffee was strong and hot, and exactly what she needed. "I just did what anyone would do. Anyone didn't do it, you did." Mamie pulled a pan of biscuits from the oven, set them on the table, still steaming. "Eat. You look half-starved." Abigail wanted to protest, wanted to maintain some shred of dignity, but her stomach betrayed her, growling loud enough that both women heard it. Mamie's expression softened just slightly, and she pushed the biscuits closer. "Go on. Plenty more where those came from." The biscuit was perfect, flaky and buttery and still warm from the oven. Abigail ate it slowly, making it last, aware of Mamie watching her with those sharp eyes that seemed to see right through to her bones. "Red says Nathan's got a proposition for you," Mamie said after a moment. "You know what it is?" "No, ma'am." "He wants to hire you as a housekeeper, help me with the cooking and cleaning and such. Lord knows I could use it. This house is too big for one old woman, and Nathan won't hire anyone I don't approve of." Abigail's hand stilled on the mug. "Why would he hire me? He doesn't know me. He knows you saved his life. Knows you didn't leave him to die by that creek when you could have just kept walking. That tells him all he needs to know about your character." Mamie refilled Abigail's coffee without being asked. "Question is, do you want the job?" Did she want it? Abigail thought of the storage room at Hargrove's, barely big enough to turn around in. Thought of her hands, raw from lye soap. Thought of the weeks and months and maybe years it would take to save enough money to build any kind of future. What would the job pay, she asked, because she'd learned long ago that hope without practical details was just another kind of foolishness. $10 a month, room and board included. Your own room upstairs, proper bed, door that locks. 3 meals a day. Sundays off if you want them, though there's always work needs doing on a ranch. $10. Abigail had been making maybe $3 a month at the boarding house, and that was on good weeks. $10 would be more money than she'd ever had in her life. Why so much? The words came out before she could stop them. That's generous, ma'am, more than generous. Mamie's expression went hard for a moment, like Abigail had insulted her somehow. Then it softened again, and what replaced it was something almost like respect. You just saved my nephew's life, child. You think that's worth $10 a month? She shook her head. Nathan wanted to give you $50 outright, as a reward. I told him that would insult you. Told him you'd rather earn your keep than take charity. Was I wrong? Abigail's throat went tight. No, Mamie wasn't wrong. The idea of taking $50 for doing what any decent person would do made her skin crawl. But work, honest work, for honest pay, that was different. You weren't wrong, she said quietly. Then the job's yours if you want it, but I'm going to tell you straight, same as Red did. This ain't charity, you'll work hard. I expect things done right, done on time, and done without complaining. Can you handle that? Abigail met Mamie's eyes. Yes, ma'am, I can. Then welcome to Broken Creek Ranch, Abigail Winters. Abigail returned to Hargrove's that afternoon to collect her few belongings, Mrs. Hargrove stood on the porch, watching as Abigail packed her carpet bag in the tiny storage room. You found something better then, Mrs. Hargrove said. It wasn't a question. I found honest work, thanks to you giving me a place to start. Abigail looked at the woman who'd shown her the first kindness in Cedar Bend. I won't forget that, ma'am. You're a good girl, Abigail Winters. That ranch is lucky to have you. The next 3 days passed in a blur of learning. Abigail rose before dawn each morning, helping Mamie prepare breakfast for the ranch hands. She learned which cowboys took their coffee black and which wanted it light. Learned that Red had a sweet tooth for Mamie's biscuits. Learned the rhythm of a working ranch, the constant flow of men and horses and cattle that never quite stopped. She scrubbed floors that gleamed like honey, washed windows until they sparkled, organized the pantry according to Mamie's exacting standards. And slowly the house began to feel less foreign. The room upstairs began to feel like hers. Nathan remained upstairs, following doctor's orders for once in his life, though Mamie reported he was restless and asking questions, asking about her. On the morning of the 4th day, Abigail was in the parlor, on her knees scrubbing the floor, when she heard the creak of stairs. She looked up. Nathan Holloway stood at the top of the staircase, one hand gripping the banister, watching her with those whiskey-colored eyes. Nathan came down the stairs carefully, against doctor's orders and Mamie's direct commands. Abigail was in the parlor on her knees scrubbing the floor when she heard the creak of the stairs and looked up to see him gripping the banister like it was the only thing keeping him upright. He looked better than he had by the creak. The color had come back to his face, and someone had shaved him and cleaned him up. But he was still pale, still moving like every step cost him something, and when his eyes found Abigail on the floor with her scrub brush and bucket, something complicated passed across his face. Surprise, maybe, or embarrassment. Like he hadn't expected to find her here, hadn't quite believed Red and Mamie when they told him she'd accepted the job. Abigail sat back on her heels, pushed a strand of hair out of her face with the back of her hand. Mr. Holloway, you should be resting. So everyone keeps telling me. His voice was rough, like he hadn't used it much in the past few days. He came down the last few steps carefully, holding the banister, and crossed the parlor to where she knelt. I wanted to thank you, properly, for what you did. You already thanked me. You gave me a job. That's not a thank you. That's basic decency." He lowered himself into one of the leather chairs, moving like an old man despite being probably only in his late 30s. "You saved my life, Miss Winters. I would have died by that creek if you hadn't found me, died alone, and nobody would have known where to look until it was too late." Abigail dipped her brush in the bucket, went back to scrubbing. She didn't want to have this conversation, didn't want to see the gratitude in his eyes, the debt he thought he owed. She'd done what needed doing, same as always, that was all. "You don't owe me anything," she said, keeping her eyes on the floor. "I was glad I could help. Red told me about your situation, about the man who didn't show up at the station." Abigail's hand stilled on the brush. She should have known. Small town, everyone knowing everyone else's business. Of course, Red had told him. Of course they'd all discussed her, the foolish girl who'd been taken in by a mail-order swindle. "Then you know I needed work," she said, and heard the edge in her own voice. "So the job isn't charity. It's something I need, and something you're willing to pay for. We're even." Nathan was quiet for a long moment. When Abigail finally risked a glance at him, she found him watching her with those whiskey-colored eyes, and the expression on his face was something she couldn't quite read. "We're not even," he said quietly. "Not by a long shot. You'll be treated with respect, and as long as you want this job, it's yours. No conditions, no expectations beyond the work. You have my word." Then he was gone, climbing the stairs back to his room, leaving Abigail alone with her bucket and brush, and a promise she wanted desperately to believe in, but didn't quite dare. The days fell into a rhythm. Abigail rose before dawn, same as she always had, but now she woke to the smell of Mamie's coffee and the sound of cowboys moving through the yard below her window. She had her own room, just like Mamie promised, small but clean, with a real bed and a quilt that smelled like lavender and sunshine. A window that looked out over the pastures, where she could see cattle grazing and horses running, and the endless sky stretching overhead. She worked alongside Mamie, learning the rhythm of the ranch house, how to make biscuits that rose high and flaky, using lard instead of butter because it made them lighter. How to brew coffee strong enough to wake the dead the way the cowboys liked it. How to tend the herb garden behind the house, where Mamie grew everything from mint to comfrey to feverfew, the same herbs Abigail's grandmother had taught her about years ago. "Your grandmother was a midwife?" Mamie asked one afternoon as they worked together harvesting yarrow. "Yes, ma'am, back in Pennsylvania. She taught me everything she knew before she passed." Mamie's hand stilled on the stems. "Then you know about healing, about tending the sick and the hurt." "Some. Enough to be useful, I hope." "More than useful." Mamie straightened, pressing a hand to the small of her back with a grimace. "I got arthritis something fierce these days. Can't hardly bend over without my joints screaming. You know anything for that?" Abigail thought of her grandmother's recipes, the ones she'd learned by heart over long afternoons in the kitchen. Yarrow compress might help, or comfrey. Both are good for inflammation. "Then you make me one of those compresses, and if it works, I'll teach you my biscuit recipe. Fair trade?" It was more than fair. It was friendship, offered carefully, like something precious that might break if handled wrong. She looked older in that moment, older and tired, and Abigail remembered suddenly that Mamie had lost people too. A husband, a brother, maybe others she didn't talk about. "I brought the compress," Abigail said softly. Mamie turned, and when she saw what Abigail carried, her face softened. "Thank you, child. My hands are singing today." Abigail knelt beside her chair, took Mamie's hands in her own, and began to wrap them in the cloth. The older woman's fingers were gnarled and stiff, the knuckles swollen, the skin paper-thin. Hands that had worked for decades, that had kneaded bread and scrubbed floors and held babies and buried loved ones. "You're good at this," Mamie said quietly. "Gentle. Your grandmother taught you well. She said healing wasn't just about the medicine. It was about the touch, about letting people know they weren't alone in their pain. Smart woman. They sat there in the gathering dark, Mamie's hands wrapped in healing herbs, the window showing them a sky full of stars beginning to emerge. And for the first time since stepping off that train in Cedar Bend, Abigail felt like maybe, just maybe, she'd found a place where she belonged. Said. Nathan started coming down for meals after that first time on the stairs. At first he was quiet, eating what Mamie put in front of him and answering questions with as few words as possible. But gradually, as his strength returned, he began to talk more. About the ranch, about the cattle, about plans for the winter and hopes for the spring. Abigail learned that he'd built Broken Creek from nothing. Started with 200 acres, bought cheap after the war, when land was plentiful and money was scarce. Worked 18-hour days for years, living in a line shack barely big enough to turn around in, saving every penny until he could buy more land, more cattle. Built the house himself with Red and a handful of cowboys who'd become more like brothers than employees. He'd been married once. Sarah. Mamie mentioned her name one evening, casual-like, and Abigail saw the way Nathan's hands tightened on his coffee cup, saw the muscle in his jaw clench. "She was a good woman," Mamie said. "Died 7 years ago come spring. Fever took her. Same fever that almost took Nathan when he was a boy." Abigail didn't ask for more details, didn't pry. But later, cleaning Nathan's study, she found a photograph in a silver frame tucked away in a desk drawer. A woman with dark hair and serious eyes, standing beside a younger version of Nathan, both of them stiff and formal in their wedding clothes. She was putting the frame back when Nathan spoke from the doorway. "That's Sarah." Abigail nearly dropped the photograph. She hadn't heard him come in, hadn't known he was watching. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to intrude." "You're not intruding. It's just a picture." But the way he said it, quiet and careful, told Abigail it was more than that. Much more. Nathan crossed the room, took the frame from her hands, looked at the woman's face for a long moment. "We were married 11 years, built this ranch together. She wanted children, but they never came. Then the fever hit, and she was gone in 3 days." "I'm so sorry," Abigail said, because what else was there to say in the face of that kind of loss? It was a long time ago. Nathan set the frame back in the drawer, closed it gently. "But sometimes this house feels haunted by all the things that should have been and never were." He looked at Abigail then, really looked at her, and she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. Not pity, not charity, something else. Something that felt like recognition, like he was seeing her, truly seeing her, in a way no one had in a very long time. "You know what that's like, don't you?" he said quietly, "living with ghosts of things that never were." Abigail thought of Charles Henderson, of the letters full of promises, of the life she'd imagined all the way across the country. Thought of the marriage certificate still tucked in her Bible, a piece of paper that represented nothing but lies and broken dreams. "Yes," she said, "I know what that's like." They stood there in the study, surrounded by books and dust motes floating in the afternoon light, and something passed between them, an understanding, a recognition of shared pain, shared disappointment, shared survival. Nathan cleared his throat, stepped back. "I should let you get back to your work." "Yes, of course." But neither of them moved, not for a long moment, not until Mamie's voice called from the kitchen, breaking the spell. After that, things changed. Small things, subtle things. Nathan started showing up in the kitchen before dawn, sitting at the table with his coffee while Abigail prepared breakfast. They didn't talk much. But they didn't need to. There was something comfortable about the silence, about the shared space, about the simple act of being in the same room without expectations or demands. He taught her to ride sable, not side saddle the way proper ladies were supposed to ride, but astride, the way the ranch women did when there was work to be done. His hands were patient on the reins, his voice calm as he explained how to sit, how to move with the horse instead of against it. "Sable can hear your heart," he said one afternoon as they rode along the creek where Abigail had found him. "If you're scared, she'll be scared. If you're calm, she'll be calm. Trust her, and she'll trust you." Abigail thought about that later, thought about trust and how hard it was to give and how easily it could be broken. Thought about Nathan Holloway, this man who'd given her work and shelter and asked for nothing in return except that she do the job she was hired for. She was falling for him. She knew it the way you know a storm is coming, before the first drops of rain fall. Knew it in the way her heart beat faster when he walked into her room. Knew it in the way she found excuses to be near him, to hear his voice, to catch those moments when he smiled and his whole face transformed. But she couldn't let herself hope. Hoping had gotten her stranded in Wyoming with nothing but 62 cents and a worthless piece of paper. Hoping was dangerous. Hoping would break her. So she kept her head down, did her work, and tried not to think about what it would feel like if Nathan Holloway ever looked at her the way a man looks at a woman he might love. The first snow came in late November, earlier than expected. Abigail woke to a world transformed, everything white and clean and impossibly quiet. She stood at her window, watching fat flakes drift down from a sky the color of old pewter, and felt something in her chest ease just slightly. Winter had always been her favorite season back in Pennsylvania. The way it covered all the ugliness and the hard edges made everything look new. The way it forced people inside, made them slow down, made them pay attention to the things that mattered. She dressed quickly, went down to start the coffee, but Nathan was already there, standing by the kitchen window, watching the snow fall with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Morning," she said softly, not wanting to startle him. He turned, and something in his face when he saw her made her stomach flutter. "Morning. Hell of a storm. Beautiful, though." "Yeah." But he wasn't looking at the snow anymore. He was looking at her. Abigail busied herself with the coffee, with the biscuits, with anything that would give her hands something to do and her eyes somewhere else to look. The air in the kitchen felt thick somehow, charged, like the moment before lightning strikes. "Abigail," Nathan's voice was quiet, careful. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why did you stay? After you found out there was no Charles Henderson, that you'd been swindled. Why didn't you go back to Pennsylvania?" The question caught her off guard. She'd expected him to ask about work, about the ranch, about anything but this. Her hands stilled on the coffee pot. "Because I had nothing to go back to," she said finally. "My father's dead. My mother died when I was young. I worked in a textile mill for 7 years, 12 hours a day, breathing lint until my lungs burned. Saved every penny I could because I wanted something more than that. Wanted a life, not just existence." She poured the coffee, set a cup in front of him. "Charles Henderson's letters, they promised me that life. A home, a family, a place where I could belong. And when I found out he didn't exist, I could have gone back to the mill. But that would have meant admitting I'd made a mistake, admitting I'd been a fool. And I guess I'm too stubborn for that." Nathan wrapped his hands around the cup, his eyes never leaving her face. "You're not a fool, Abigail. You're brave. There's a difference. Brave people don't get swindled. Brave people take chances. Sometimes those chances work out. Sometimes they don't. But you're still here, still standing. That's what matters." Something in Abigail's chest cracked open, just a little. She wanted to believe him, wanted to think that maybe her stubbornness wasn't stupidity, that maybe staying had been the right choice after all. The kitchen door burst open, letting in a swirl of snow and cold air. Red stamped his boots on the mat, pulled off his hat to reveal hair dusted white with frost. "Boss, we got trouble. Storm's getting worse, and the cattle in the north pasture are bunching up near that old fence line. If they push through, we'll lose half of them to the canyon." Nathan was on his feet immediately, the moment between him and Abigail forgotten, or at least set aside. "Get the boys together. We need to move them to the lower pasture before the fence gives." "Already done. But we need every hand. This storm's going to be a bad one." Nathan was already moving toward the door, grabbing his coat from the peg. He paused, looked back at Abigail. "Stay inside. Keep the fires going. We might be out there a while." Then he was gone, Red behind him, and Abigail was alone in the kitchen with the smell of coffee and biscuits and the sound of wind beginning to howl around the corners of the house. She stood at the window and watched them ride out, dark shapes against the white, disappearing into the storm. And she prayed, harder than she'd prayed since the day her father died, that they would all come back safe. The day stretched into night. The storm howled and screamed, piling snow against the house in drifts that reached the bottom of the windows. Mamie moved through the house like a general preparing for siege, making sure there was wood for the fires, water in the buckets, food ready for when the men came back. If they came back. "They'll be fine," Mamie said, seeing the worry on Abigail's face. "Nathan's been through worse storms than this. He knows what he's doing." But even Mamie's eyes went to the window every few minutes, searching the white emptiness for any sign of movement. It was past midnight when they finally heard horses in the yard. Abigail and Mamie both rushed to the door, threw it open to see cowboys stumbling in from the cold, their faces red and raw, their clothes stiff with ice. They'd saved the cattle, all of them, moved them to safety just before the fence gave way, exactly like Red had feared. But the cost had been high. 3 men with frostbite on their fingers and toes, 2 horses that had gone lame and had to be led back slow, and Nathan, who came in last, moving like every step was agony, his face gray beneath the frost. "Boss is hurt," Red said quietly to Mamie, his voice tight with worry. "Horse went down in a drift. He hit hard." Abigail didn't wait for permission. She moved to Nathan's side, got her shoulder under his arm, took his weight. Up close, she could feel him trembling, could hear the hitch in his breathing that meant broken ribs or worse. "Easy," she murmured. "I've got you. Same as before." He looked at her, his eyes unfocused with pain, but something in them cleared when he recognized her. "Abigail. Come on, let's get you inside, let's get you warm." Together, she and Red got him up to his room, got him out of his frozen clothes and into dry ones, got him into bed with blankets piled high. Mamie brought willow bark tea for the pain, but Nathan's teeth were chattering too hard to drink it. "He needs heat," Abigail said, her mind going to her grandmother's teachings. "Body heat. It's the fastest way to warm him." Mamie looked at her, then at Nathan, then back at Abigail. Something passed across the older woman's face. Understanding, maybe, or permission. "I'll be downstairs if you need me," Mamie said quietly, and closed the door behind her. Abigail stood beside the bed, her heart hammering. This was improper. This was dangerous. This was exactly the kind of thing that could ruin what little reputation she had left. But Nathan was shaking so hard the bed frame was rattling, and his lips had gone blue, and if she didn't do something, he might not make it through the night. She kicked off her shoes, pulled back the blankets, and climbed into the bed beside him. Wrapped her arms around him, pressed her body against his, shared her warmth the way her grandmother had taught her to do for patients suffering from exposure. Nathan's arms came around her instinctively, pulling her closer. His face pressed into her hair, and she felt his breath, ragged and harsh, against her neck. "I've got you," she whispered. "You're safe. I've got you." Time lost meaning. Could have been minutes. Could have been hours. Abigail held Nathan in the darkness, felt his trembling slowly ease, felt warmth begin to return to his skin. And somewhere in that timeless space, something shifted between them. When Nathan finally spoke, his voice was rough and low and right against her ear. "Abigail, I can't lose you." Her breath caught. "What?" "When I was out there in the storm, when the horse went down and I thought I might not make it back, all I could think was that I'd never told you, never said the words." "Nathan, you're not thinking clearly. The cold, the pain. I'm thinking clearer than I have in 7 years. His arms tightened around her. "I'm falling in love with you, Abigail Winters. Have been since the day you saved my life. maybe before that. Maybe from the moment I opened my eyes and saw you kneeling beside me by that creek, looking at me like I mattered, like my life was worth saving. Abigail's eyes burned. You don't know me. You don't know what I've done, what I've been. I know you're strong. I know you're kind. I know you work harder than any two men I've ever met. I know you could have left me to die, and no one would have blamed you. But you didn't. He pulled back just enough to look at her face in the dim light from the dying fire. I know that when I look at you, I see someone worth waiting for. Worth hoping for. I'm damaged goods, Nathan. A woman who got left at a train station, who was too foolish to see she was being lied to. You're a woman who had the courage to take a chance on something better. That's not foolish, that's brave. His hand came up, cupped her face, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. I'm not asking you to feel the same way. I'm just asking you not to leave. Stay here. Let me prove to you that not all men are liars. Let me show you what it looks like when someone keeps their promises. Abigail closed her eyes, felt tears slip free despite her best efforts. She'd been alone for so long, had been so careful, so guarded, so determined not to hope. But here in the darkness, wrapped in Nathan Holloway's arms, she felt something she thought she'd lost forever in that train station. She felt like she'd come home. I'm scared, she whispered. So am I. What if this doesn't work? What if I'm not what you think I am? Then we'll figure it out. Together. He pressed his forehead to hers. I'm not asking you to marry me tomorrow, Abigail. I'm not Charles Henderson making promises I can't keep. I'm just asking you to stay. To give us, a chance. She opened her eyes, met his gaze in the firelight, saw truth there, saw hope, saw a future that might, if she was brave enough to reach for it, actually be real. Okay, she breathed. Okay, I'll stay. And when Nathan Holloway kissed her, gentle and reverent and full of promise, Abigail Winters finally let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, some promises were worth believing in after all. Winter deepened over Broken Creek Ranch, and with it came a kind of peace that Abigail had never known before. The days were short and cold, the nights long and dark, but inside the white house on the hill there was warmth. There was laughter. There was the slow, careful building of something that felt like it might actually last. Nathan recovered from his injuries, though he moved slower now, more careful. The broken ribs healed, but they left him with an ache when the weather turned cold, a reminder that even strong men could be broken if they weren't careful. He courted Abigail the old-fashioned way, slow and respectful, with a patience that amazed her. There were no more nights spent wrapped in each other's arms, not since that storm night when desperation and cold had pushed them together. Instead, there were morning coffees shared in comfortable silence, evenings on the porch, watching the sun set over snow-covered pastures, rides on Sable, with Nathan teaching her the boundaries of the ranch, showing her the land he'd built his life on. And there were gifts, small things, thoughtful things. A new pair of gloves when he noticed her old ones were worn through, a book of poetry he'd ordered from Denver because she'd mentioned once that she missed reading, a jar of apple butter from town, and when she'd opened it, he'd watched her face carefully. You like apple butter? He'd asked. My grandmother used to make it, every fall. The smell of it cooking would fill the whole house. Abigail had opened the jar, breathed deep, and for a moment she was back in Pennsylvania, 10 years old, standing in her grandmother's kitchen. I haven't had it since she died. The next day, Nathan had Red bring up bushels of apples from the root cellar, crab apples, small and tart, the kind that grew wild along the creek banks. He'd set them on the kitchen table and looked at Abigail with something like hope in his eyes. Mamie says you know how to make it, the apple butter. I do? Grandmother taught me. Would you? Make some, I mean, for the house? So Abigail had made apple butter, spent 2 days peeling and coring and cooking, stirring the massive pot on the stove until the apples broke down into something smooth and sweet and perfect. The smell had filled the house, just like it had in her grandmother's kitchen. And when she'd turned to say something to Mamie, she'd found Nathan standing in the doorway, watching her with an expression that made her heart stutter. "What?" she'd asked, suddenly self-conscious. "Nothing, just, you belong here, in this kitchen, in this house." He'd cleared his throat, looked away. "I'm glad you stayed, Abigail." "So am I." The apple butter had been better than any she remembered. Or maybe it was just that she was making it in a place where she felt safe, with people who cared whether she lived or died, with a man who looked at her like she was something precious. She'd filled a dozen jars, lined them up on the shelf in the pantry, and every time Nathan saw them, something in his face softened, like those jars represented more than just preserves, like they were proof that she was making a home here, putting down roots, choosing to stay. Christmas came and went. Mamie roasted a goose, and the cowboys who had nowhere else to go crowded into the big house for dinner. Red played fiddle, and one of the younger hands knew how to play harmonica, and they sang songs that were older than any of them, songs about home and family and the things that mattered when the world got cold and dark. Nathan gave Abigail a shawl, soft wool dyed the color of deep blue, the color of twilight. She gave him a shirt she'd sewn herself, working late at night by lamplight when he thought she was sleeping. When he'd opened it, when he'd seen the careful stitches and the monogram she'd embroidered on the cuff, his initials in thread, the color of wheat, his eyes had gone bright. "Abigail," he'd said, and couldn't seem to find more words. "It's just a shirt." "It's not just a shirt." He'd held it like it was made of gold. "It's the most thoughtful gift anyone's given me in years." That night, after the cowboys had gone back to the bunkhouse and Mamie had retired to her room, Nathan had walked Abigail to the bottom of the stairs. The house was quiet except for the pop and hiss of the dying fire in the parlor and the wind outside singing its winter song. "Abigail," Nathan had said, his voice low and careful, "I know we said we'd take this slow, and I meant that. But I need you to know something." "What?" "I'm going to marry you, someday, when you're ready. When you trust that I mean what I say." He'd taken her hand, held it between both of his. "I'm not Charles Henderson. I won't disappear. I won't lie. What I promise, I'll keep. And I promise you this, I'll wait as long as it takes for you to believe that." Abigail's throat had gone tight. "Nathan!" "You don't have to say anything. Not now. I just wanted you to know, so you could think about it, so you could decide if that's something you might want too." Then he'd kissed her hand, gentle and reverent, and walked away, leaving Abigail standing at the bottom of the stairs with her heart pounding and her mind racing. She'd gone to her room, had pulled out the marriage certificate from where it was still tucked in her Bible, had looked at Charles Henderson's signature, bold and false, had thought about burning it, about throwing it away, about finally letting go of that particular ghost, but she'd folded it again instead, put it back. Not because she wanted to hold on to the pain, but because she wanted to remember, wanted to hold on to the lesson it taught her, that some promises were empty, but that meant other promises, the real ones, mattered even more. Spring came late to Wyoming that year, fighting winter for every inch of ground. But when it finally arrived, when the snow began to melt, and the creeks ran high, and the first green shoots pushed up through the brown grass, it felt like a victory. Abigail planted a garden behind the house, herbs mostly, feverfew and yarrow and comfrey, the plants her grandmother had taught her about, but also vegetables, carrots and potatoes and beans, things that would feed the house through the next winter, things that would last. Nathan had helped her turn the soil, had built her a fence to keep the deer out, had brought her seeds from town without being asked. And when she'd looked at him, questioning, he'd just shrugged. A good garden needs good seeds, and you're a good gardener, seems like common sense to me. The garden became her refuge, a place where she could work with her hands, could watch things grow, could create something beautiful and useful out of nothing but dirt and water and patience. On warm afternoons, she'd kneel in the soil, pulling weeds and tending the young plants, and Nathan would find excuses to be nearby. Fixing the fence, checking on the horses in the nearby corral. Never quite saying he was there to be near her, but always close enough that they could talk if they wanted to. And they did talk, about everything and nothing. About his plans for the ranch, her memories of Pennsylvania. About books they'd read and places they'd never been, but hoped to see someday. About small things that didn't matter and big things that did. One afternoon in late April, as Abigail was harvesting the first of the spring lettuce, she heard hoofbeats coming up the road at a pace that spoke of urgency. She stood, shading her eyes against the sun, and saw a horse and rider approaching fast, dust rising behind them like smoke. The rider was a stranger, young, maybe 20, with a face burned red by the sun and wind. He pulled up in the yard, his horse blowing hard, and called out, "Looking for Nathan Holloway." "This the Broken Creek?" Nathan appeared from the barn, Red beside him. "I'm Holloway. What's the trouble?" The young man dismounted, pulled a folded paper from his saddlebag, held it out. "Got a telegram for you from Cedar Bend. Sheriff says it's urgent." Nathan took the paper, unfolded it, read, and Abigail watched the color drain from his face like water from a broken barrel. "What is it?" Red asked, his voice sharp with concern. Nathan looked up, and his eyes found Abigail across the yard. Something in his expression made her stomach drop. "It's about Charles Henderson," Nathan said. "The man who swindled Abigail. He's been caught. He's in Cedar Bend, and he's asking to see her." The world tilted slightly. Abigail gripped the fence rail to steady herself, felt the rough wood bite into her palms. Charles Henderson, the name that had haunted her for months. The man who'd stolen $40 and her trust and left her stranded in a strange town with nothing. He was here, in Cedar Bend, and he wanted to see her. "No," Nathan said, and there was steel in his voice. "Absolutely not. She's not going anywhere near that man." But Abigail was already moving, crossing the yard with steps that felt steadier than they should. She took the telegram from Nathan's hand, read it herself. The words were brief, formal. Charles Henderson arrested for mail fraud and theft. Multiple victims. Awaiting trial. Requesting to speak with Miss Abigail Winters. "I need to go," she said quietly. "The hell you do." Nathan's hands closed around her shoulders, gentle but firm. "Abigail, that man hurt you. Lied to you. You don't owe him anything. I know I don't owe him. But I need to see him. I need to look him in the eye and know that he's real. That he's not just a ghost I made up in my head." "Why? What good will it do?" Abigail looked up at Nathan, this man who'd given her everything, who'd been patient and kind and true. "Because I need to put him behind me, really behind me. And I can't do that until I face him." Nathan's jaw clenched. She could see the war happening behind his eyes, the desire to protect her, fighting against the respect for her choices. Finally, he nodded. "Then I'm coming with you, and Red, and half the damn ranch if I have to. You're not facing that bastard alone." They rode into Cedar Bend the next morning. Nathan and Abigail on Sable, Red on his buckskin, and 3 more cowboys following behind like an honor guard. The town looked the same as it had 6 months ago when Abigail had stepped off the train. Same dusty street, same false front buildings, same church with the leaning steeple. But Abigail was different. She sat straight in the saddle, her head high, her hands steady on the reins. She wore the blue shawl Nathan had given her at Christmas, and the good dress Mamie had helped her make. She looked like what she was, a woman who belonged somewhere, a woman who had people standing beside her. The sheriff's office was at the end of the main street. Sheriff Carter came out when he saw them approaching, a man in his middle 40s with a weather-beaten face and eyes that had seen too much. "Mr. Holloway, Miss Winters, appreciate you coming." "Where is he?" Nathan's voice was cold, controlled. "In the back cell. Been there 3 days now. Caught him trying the same scheme in Laramie. Woman there wasn't as trusting as most. Went straight to the law." "How many?" Abigail asked. "How many women did he swindle?" Sheriff Carter's expression went grim. 12 that we know of. Could be more. He's been working this game for 2 years, moving from territory to territory. Took over $600 total. Some women lost everything they had. Sheriff Carter reached into his desk drawer, pulled out a wrinkled envelope. "There's more, Mr. Holloway. Found this in Henderson's belongings when we arrested him." Nathan took the envelope, unfolded the paper inside. His jaw tightened as he read. Abigail watched his knuckles go white around the edge of the letter. "What is it?" she asked quietly. "Instructions." Nathan's voice was cold, controlled. "Telling Henderson which territories to work, which towns had vulnerable populations. There's a list of newspaper editors who'd been paid to run the marriage advertisements." He turned the paper over. "And it's signed with initials, R.H." Red stepped closer, read over Nathan's shoulder. "Robert Hensley, the banker from Cheyenne. I know that name. He holds mortgages on half the ranches in 3 counties. Sheriff Carter nodded grimly. "We've suspected Hensley for months. Runs a lending operation that preys on desperate folks. This mail-order scheme was just another way for him to make money off people suffering. Henderson wasn't the mastermind, he was just the hired hand." How many others? Abigail's hands had begun to shake. If Hensley was funding multiple men like Henderson, could be dozens, could be more. We won't know until we can bring Hensley in, and that takes evidence we can use in court. The sheriff looked at Nathan. "This letter might be enough. With your testimony about where we found it, we might finally be able to stop him." Nathan folded the paper with precise, angry movements. "You'll have my testimony, every word. And anything else you need. $600, 12 women. All of them probably like Abigail, desperate for something better, hopeful enough to believe in a stranger's promises. Foolish enough, they probably thought now, to trust." "I want to see him," Abigail said. The sheriff nodded. "Figured you might, but Miss Winters, before you go in there, you should know. He's going to try to manipulate you. It's what he does. It's how he's survived this long. Don't let him get in your head." "I won't." Nathan started to follow her, but Abigail put a hand on his chest, stopped him. "No, I need to do this alone. Abigail, please trust me. I need to face him by myself, to know I can." Something in Nathan's expression cracked just slightly, but he nodded, stepped back. "I'll be right outside. If you need me, you call out." The jail cell was at the back of the building, separated from the front office by a heavy door. Sheriff Carter unlocked it, led Abigail through, then stepped back to give her space. Charles Henderson sat on a narrow cot, his back against the stone wall. He was younger than Abigail expected, maybe 30, with light brown hair and a face that would have been handsome if it wasn't for the calculating coldness in his eyes. He looked up when she entered, and something that might have been relief crossed his face. "Abigail, thank God. I was hoping you'd come. His voice was exactly as she remembered from her imagination, from the way she'd read his letters over and over on the train west. Smooth, confident, warm. The voice of a man you could trust. But Abigail heard it differently now, heard the hollowness underneath, the practiced charm, the lies that came as easy as breathing. "Mr. Henderson," she said, keeping her voice flat, emotionless. "Or is that even your real name?" He had the grace to look embarrassed. "It's real enough. Charles Henderson from Missouri, though I've used other names in other places." "Why did you ask to see me?" "Because I wanted to apologize. What I did to you, to all those women, it was wrong. I know that now, and I wanted you to know I'm sorry." Abigail studied him, this man who'd shaped the last 6 months of her life without ever meeting her. Looked for signs of genuine remorse, genuine regret, saw nothing but performance. He was sorry he'd been caught, maybe. Sorry he was sitting in a jail cell waiting for trial, but sorry for what he'd done to her? She didn't think so. "You're not sorry," she said quietly. "You're just sorry your scheme finally caught up with you." Henderson's expression shifted, hardened. "You don't know that. You don't know what it's like trying to survive out here with nothing. I did what I had to do. You stole from women who had less than nothing, women who were desperate enough to believe in you. See. And you landed on your feet, didn't you? His eyes moved over her, taking in the good dress, the shawl, the way she stood. "I heard about you. The mail-order bride who ended up at the Broken Creek Ranch. Quite a step up from what I was offering." Abigail felt something hot and sharp rise in her chest. Anger. Real anger, the kind she'd been pushing down for months because she'd been too busy surviving to let herself feel it. "You have no idea what I went through. The nights I went to bed hungry, the work I did for pennies, the shame of being the woman everyone whispered about. And you sit there and act like I should be grateful? I'm just saying it worked out for you. Better than if I'd actually been there waiting at the station." And there it was, the truth underneath all the apologies and the smooth words. He didn't care about the women he'd hurt, didn't care about the lives he'd disrupted. He cared about himself, about his own comfort, his own survival. Abigail took a step closer to the bars, looked him dead in the eye. "You're right about one thing. It did work out for me, not because of you, in spite of you. I survived what you did to me. I built a life. I found people who actually keep their promises. And the only reason I came here today was to see your face and know that you're not worth the space you've been taking up in my head." Henderson's expression went ugly. "You think you're better than me? You're just a farm girl who got lucky." "No. I'm a woman who worked for everything she has, who earned respect and a place to belong. You wouldn't understand that. You've never worked an honest day in your life." She turned to leave, then paused, looked back one more time. "I forgive you, not because you deserve it, but because I'm done carrying you around with me. You get to sit in this cell and think about what you've done. I get to go home to people who love me. I know which one of us got the better deal." Then she walked out, leaving Charles Henderson sitting in his cell, and she didn't look back. Nathan was waiting in the front office, his body tense as a coiled spring. When he saw her face, saw that she was all right, some of the tension drained away. "You good?" he asked quietly. "I'm good." And she was. She felt lighter somehow, like she'd set down a weight she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten it was there. "I'm ready to go home." Nathan held out his hand. Abigail took it. And together they walked out of the sheriff's office and into the bright spring sunshine. The next Sunday, Abigail walked to church for the first time since Charles Henderson's arrest. She wore her good dress and the blue shawl Nathan had given her, her spine straight despite the butterflies in her stomach. Nathan wanted to come with her, but she'd asked him to wait outside. This was something she needed to do alone. When she entered the small white church, the congregation turned to look. She expected whispers, expected judgment, expected the same cold eyes that had greeted her 6 months ago. But Martha Keene did something unexpected. She stood up from the front pew. The entire church went silent. "Miss Winters," Martha's voice carried through the quiet space, "I owe you an apology. A public one, before God and this congregation." Abigail froze in the doorway, her hand gripping the frame. Martha stepped into the aisle, her face flushed but determined. "When you arrived in Cedar Bend, I judged you harshly, called you foolish for being swindled, said you'd come to a bad end." Her voice wavered slightly. "I was cruel, and I was wrong." She took a breath, her eyes meeting Abigail's. "Yesterday, I heard how you faced that man in the jail, how you looked him in the eye and refused to be diminished by what he'd done, how you walked away with your dignity intact." Martha's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "You're not a victim, Miss Winters. You're one of the strongest women I've ever met, and Cedar Bend is blessed to have you." A murmur of agreement rippled through the congregation. Pastor Grant smiled from the pulpit, nodding his approval. Martha held out her hand. "Can you forgive an old fool?" Abigail walked down the aisle, her heart pounding. She took Martha's hand, squeezed it gently. "There's nothing to forgive, Mrs. Keene. We all do the best we can with what we know." "You're a better woman than I deserve," Martha whispered. Then louder to the congregation, "Let it be known that Abigail Winters has my respect and my friendship, if she'll have it." Applause broke out, soft at first, then growing. And when Abigail took her seat, it wasn't in the back row where strangers sat. It was in the third pew, right behind the Keens. When she walked out after the service, Nathan was waiting by the wagon. He took one look at her face and smiled. They finally saw what I saw from the beginning. What's that? Someone worth fighting for. The ride back to Broken Creek was quiet, but it was a comfortable quiet. Peaceful. Abigail sat in front of Nathan on Sable, his arms around her, keeping her steady, and watched the land roll past. The mountains in the distance, still capped with snow, the meadows turning green, the sky so blue it looked like something out of a painting. This was home now, not Pennsylvania, with its mills and memories and ghosts of people long gone. Here, this land, this house, these people. Nathan must have felt her thinking because his arms tightened slightly around her waist. "What are you thinking about?" "That I'm glad I didn't get on a train back east. That I'm glad I stayed." "So am I." His voice was warm against her ear. "Abigail, there's something I need to ask you, and I was going to wait, was going to give you more time. But watching you walk into that jail cell today, seeing you face down the man who hurt you and come out stronger, I realized something." "What?" "That you don't need more time. You're already the strongest person I know. You're already exactly who you're meant to be, and I don't want to wait anymore." He pulled Sable to a stop at the top of a rise, where you could see the whole ranch spread out below. The White House, the red barn, the gardens and corrals and endless pastures, everything he'd built, everything he'd created. Nathan dismounted, then helped Abigail down, held both her hands in his, and looked at her with those whiskey-colored eyes she'd come to know so well. "Abigail Winters, I know this isn't romantic. I know I'm standing here in the middle of nowhere with dirt on my boots and dust in my hair. But this is who I am. This land, this life, it's all I have to offer. That, and my word that I'll spend every day for the rest of my life trying to deserve you." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a ring, simple gold, worn smooth with age. "This was my mother's, and her mother's before that. It's been waiting for the right woman, and that woman is you." Abigail's eyes burned. She looked at the ring, at Nathan's face, at the ranch spread out below them like a promise made real. "I've been in love with you since the day you saved my life," Nathan continued. "Maybe before that. Maybe from the first moment I opened my eyes and saw you kneeling beside me by the creek, looking at me like I mattered. And I want to spend whatever time the Lord gives me proving to you that you matter too, that you're not damaged goods or a woman nobody wanted. You're the woman I want, the only woman I want, today, tomorrow, and every day after that, until they put me in the ground." "Nathan," Abigail whispered, and couldn't find more words because her throat had closed up tight. "Marry me, Abigail. Not because you need a husband or a home or security, but because you want to. Because when you think about the future, you want me in it. Marry me because you love me even half as much as I love you." Abigail looked at him, this man who'd given her everything and asked for nothing, who'd been patient when she needed time, gentle when she needed care, strong when she needed support, who'd kept every promise he'd ever made to her, who'd shown her what it looked like when words matched actions. She thought about the girl who'd stepped off the train 6 months ago, lost and alone and terrified. Thought about the woman she'd become, strong, capable, loved. "Yes," she said, and the word came out clear and sure. "Yes, Nathan Holloway, I'll marry you." The smile that broke across Nathan's face was like sunrise. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit like it had been made for her, like it had been waiting all these years just to come home. Then he kissed her, there on the hilltop, with the whole world spread out before them, and Abigail felt something settle deep in her chest. This was real. This was lasting. This was the life she was supposed to have all along. When they finally pulled apart, Nathan rested his forehead against hers. "I'm going to make you happy, Abigail. I swear it." "You already have." They rode the rest of the way back to the ranch with Abigail's left hand resting on Nathan's arm, the ring catching the sunlight. When they came over the last rise and the house came into view, Mamie was standing on the porch, her hand shading her eyes. When she saw the way they were riding, saw something in their faces, she let out a whoop that could probably be heard in Cedar Bend. "About damn time," she called out. "I was beginning to think you two were going to dance around each other until we were all dead and buried." Red appeared from the barn, took one look, and grinned wide. "Boss finally worked up the nerve, did he?" "He did," Abigail said, and couldn't keep the smile off her face if she tried. "Well then." Red pulled off his hat, held it over his heart. "Welcome to the family, Miss Abigail, though I reckon you've been family for a while now." They were married a month later in the little church in Cedar Bend with the leaning steeple. The whole town turned out, the same people who'd whispered about Abigail when she first arrived now filling the pews to see her wed. Mrs. Martha Keene sat in the front row, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Mrs. Hargrove, who'd given Abigail that first room when she had nothing, beamed like a proud mother. Abigail wore a dress Mamie had helped her make, simple white cotton with lace at the collar and cuffs. She carried wildflowers from the meadow behind the ranch, tied with a ribbon the color of wheat. And when she walked down the aisle on Red Callahan's arm, she kept her spine straight and her eyes on Nathan, standing at the altar in his good suit, looking at her like she was the answer to every prayer he'd ever prayed. Pastor Grant kept the ceremony short and simple, the way Nathan had requested. The words were old and familiar, promises that had been spoken by countless couples before them and would be spoken by countless more after, to have and to hold, for better or worse, in sickness and in health, until death parted them. But when Nathan spoke those words, looking into Abigail's eyes, she heard something underneath them, a promise that went deeper than the ceremony, a vow that he would keep not because tradition demanded it, but because he chose to, every single day. And when it came time for Abigail to speak her vows, she found her voice steady and clear. "I promise you won't face another storm alone. I promise you won't live in winter anymore. I promise to love you not just with words, but with actions, every day, for the rest of my life." Nathan's eyes went bright. He took both her hands in his, squeezed tight. Pastor Grant smiled. "By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Nathan, you may kiss your bride." And he did. There in the church full of people who'd become her community, her family, Nathan Holloway kissed Abigail Winters Holloway like she was precious, like she was everything, like she was home. The town threw them a celebration after, tables set up in the street with food and music and dancing. Cowboys from Broken Creek mixed with townspeople, everyone united in the simple joy of seeing two people who'd found each other despite all the odds. As the sun set and the lanterns were lit and the fiddle music filled the cooling air, Nathan pulled Abigail close on the makeshift dance floor. "Happy?" he asked quietly. "More than I ever thought possible." "Good. Because this is just the beginning, Abigail. We've got a lifetime ahead of us." And they did. Now, friend, I could end the story here with the wedding and the happy ending and the promise of forever. But that wouldn't be the whole truth, because the real story, the one that matters most, is what came after. 2 years after the wedding, in the spring of 1885, Abigail gave birth to their first child, a boy they named Samuel Nathan, with his father's dark hair and his mother's determined chin. He came into the world screaming, red-faced and furious, and when Nathan held him for the first time, the man who'd faced down mountain lions and blizzards and all the hardships the West could throw at him, wept like a child. "We have a son," he kept saying, wonder in his voice. "Abigail, we have a son." Sarah Grace followed in 1887, named for the woman who'd loved Nathan first, who'd started him on the path that led to this family. Mamie, holding the baby in her arms, said it was fitting, said Sarah would be pleased to know her name lived on. Then came Ruth Elizabeth in 1889, a girl with Abigail's eyes and Nathan's stubborn streak. Elijah arrived in 1891, quiet and thoughtful from the start, and finally Margaret in 1894, the baby of the family who would grow up fiercer than all her older siblings combined. 5 children, in 9 years. The house that had been haunted by silence for so long now rang with laughter and tears and the beautiful chaos of a growing family. Abigail opened her apothecary in Cedar Bend in 1892, just like she'd dreamed, but it became more than a shop. It became a refuge. The first woman who came wasn't looking for herbs. She was looking for hope. Her name was Emma Parker, and she was 20 years old, 7 months pregnant, and had been abandoned by a man who'd promised to marry her. She had nowhere to go and no one to turn to. Abigail took her in without hesitation. Emma's baby, a girl named Hope, was born that winter in the room above the apothecary. Abigail delivered her, same as her grandmother had delivered dozens of babies back in Pennsylvania. And when Emma asked what she owed, Abigail said the same thing Mrs. Hargrove had once said to her: "Help me with the shop. Earn your keep. That's payment enough." Emma stayed, and then others came. Women who'd been swindled, abandoned, widowed, or cast out. By 1895, the apothecary couldn't hold them all. Nathan helped Abigail purchase the old Hargrove boarding house, and together they transformed it into something Cedar Bend had never seen before. They called it Second Chance Home. It wasn't charity. Every woman who came there worked. Abigail taught them about herbs and healing. Mamie taught them cooking and household management. Sarah, when she got older, taught them to read and write. The women learned skills that would support them wherever life took them next. Some stayed in Cedar Bend, married local men, built families. Others moved on to Denver, to Cheyenne, to California. But all of them left stronger than they'd arrived. Over 30 years, Second Chance Home helped 87 women and 32 children. It became Abigail's legacy, the thing she was most proud of, besides her own 5 children, because she understood what it meant to arrive somewhere with nothing. She understood what it meant to be given a second chance, and she made sure that every woman who needed one got it. Nathan expanded the ranch, but never so much that it took him away from his family. He was there for every first word, every first step, every scraped knee and childhood crisis. He taught Samuel to ride and rope and read the weather, taught Sarah that girls could do anything boys could, only better, taught all his children that your word was your bond, that hard work mattered, that family came first. Red Callahan lived to be 78, long enough to see Samuel take over as foreman, long enough to hold all 5 of Nathan's children and tell them stories about their father when he was young and wild. When he died in 1906, peaceful in his sleep, Nathan buried him on the hill overlooking the ranch with a marker that read simply, "Red Callahan, friend." Mamie lived even longer, making it to 86, still baking biscuits and giving orders until the day before she passed. She taught Abigail everything she knew about running a ranch household, about feeding hungry cowboys and keeping a home that felt like sanctuary. And when she died in 1919, the whole county came to pay their respects. The children grew. Samuel married in 1910, brought his wife Mary to live at Broken Creek, had 4 children of his own. Sarah became a doctor, one of the first women in Wyoming to do so, opening a practice in Cheyenne, but coming home every summer with her own children in tow. Ruth, Elijah, and Margaret all found their own paths, but they never strayed far from the ranch that had shaped them. And through it all, Nathan and Abigail, growing older together, gray creeping into their hair, lines deepening around their eyes, bodies moving slower, but hearts still beating strong for each other. On autumn afternoons, when the work was done and the grandchildren were playing in the yard, you could find them on the porch. Nathan in his rocking chair, Abigail in hers, watching the sun set over land they'd built a life on. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they sat in comfortable silence. But always their hands were linked, fingers intertwined, holding on. In 1924, when Abigail was 71 and Nathan was 79, they celebrated their 41st wedding anniversary. The house was full again. 3 generations gathered to honor the couple who'd started it all. There was food and music and stories told about the old days, when Wyoming was wilder and life was harder and love was the thing that got you through. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Nathan found Abigail in the kitchen. She was making apple butter, same as she did every fall, stirring the pot on the stove while the smell filled the house. "You're still making that," he said, coming to stand beside her. "Always, as long as I can." She looked at him, this man she'd loved for more than 40 years, and smiled. "Do you remember? The first time I made it, you stood in that doorway and watched me, and I didn't know why." "I knew then," Nathan said quietly. "Knew you were home. Knew I was going to spend the rest of my life with you." "Were you scared?" "Terrified. But it was the best kind of scared. The kind that means you're about to do something that matters." Abigail set down the spoon, turned to face him fully. "Nathan Holloway, we've had a good life, haven't we?" "The best life." He cupped her face in his hands, weathered and scarred from decades of ranch work, but still gentle, still careful with her after all these years. "No regrets, Abigail?" She thought about the girl who'd stepped off the train in Cedar Bend, lost and alone, and carrying a worthless piece of paper. Thought about everything that had happened since. The pain and the joy, the fear and the love, the building of a life from nothing but hope and hard work. "Only one regret," she said, "that I didn't meet you 25 years sooner. But maybe we needed those years, needed to become the people we had to be to find each other." Maybe so. They stood there in the kitchen, the smell of apple butter surrounding them, and Nathan pulled Abigail into a slow dance with no music except their own heartbeats. Winter came early that year. By November, the snows were heavy, the temperatures brutal. Nathan caught a cold that turned into pneumonia, and despite everything Abigail knew about healing, despite all her herbs and remedies and prayers, he grew weaker. On January 15, 1936, with Abigail holding his hand and all their children gathered around the bed, Nathan Holloway took his last breath. He was 90. He'd lived a full life, a good life, a life that mattered. Abigail held him for a long time after, her head on his chest, feeling the stillness where his heartbeat had been. The children tried to comfort her, tried to pull her away, but she wouldn't move. Not yet. She needed these last few moments with the man who'd given her everything. "Thank you," she whispered against his still chest. "Thank you for waiting for me. Thank you for keeping your promises. Thank you for loving me when I didn't think anyone could." They buried him on the hill next to Red, overlooking the land he'd loved. The whole county came. Cowboys he'd employed, families he'd helped, children he'd delivered personally when winter made roads impassable and doctors couldn't get through. Every life he'd touched, and there were so many of them, came to pay their respects. After the funeral, Samuel asked his mother what she wanted to do, where she wanted to live. If she wanted to move in with one of the children, be taken care of for once, instead of always being the one doing the caring, but Abigail shook her head. "I'm staying here, in this house. This is where Nathan and I built our life. This is where I'll finish mine." And she did, for 18 more hours. On January 16, 1936, Abigail Winters Holloway, 83 years old, died in her sleep in the bed she'd shared with her husband for 41 years. They found her in the morning, peaceful, her hands stretched across the empty space where Nathan had always slept, like even in death she'd been reaching for him. Samuel, going through his mother's things later, found something tucked in her Bible, a piece of paper folded small and yellowed with age. When he opened it, he saw what it was, a marriage certificate signed by someone named Charles Henderson, dated August 1883. He showed it to his wife Mary, who read it and shook her head in wonder. "She kept it all these years?" "As a reminder, I think," Samuel said, "of where she started, what she survived, how far she'd come." They buried Abigail next to Nathan, so close their headstones touched. Samuel had the inscriptions carved carefully, wanting to get the words exactly right. Nathan's stone read, "Nathan Holloway, 1845 to 1936. He waited for the right woman, and she was worth every moment. Abigail's read, Abigail Winters Holloway, 1853 to 1936. She came with nothing but dignity. She left a legacy of love. Now, friend, I'm an old man myself. 85 come next March, if the Lord sees fit to let me make it that far. And I've been thinking a lot lately about legacy, about what we leave behind when our time comes. Some folks, they measure legacy in acres or cattle or money in the bank, and sure, those things matter. The Broken Creek Ranch is still in the family 5 generations later. 12,000 acres now, run by my nephew's grandson, who carries Nathan's name and his sense of honor. But the real legacy, the one that matters most, isn't the land, it's the love. It's the family that started with a woman stepping off a train with nothing and a man who saw worth in her that nobody else could see. It's the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who grew up hearing stories about the mail-order bride who saved a cowboy's life and ended up saving his heart too. It's in every jar of apple butter made from Abigail's recipe, passed down through 5 generations of women in this family. It's in the apothecary shop in Cedar Bend that still bears her name, now run by Sarah's granddaughter. It's in the way we teach our children that your word is your bond, that hard work matters, that love is a choice you make every single day. I never met Nathan and Abigail. They were gone before I was born. But I grew up hearing stories about them from my grandfather Samuel, who told them with pride and love and a kind of reverence. And when I hold my own great-grandchildren now, when I tell them about the woman who came west on a lie and found a truth that lasted a lifetime, I see their eyes light up. Because this isn't just a story about 2 people who fell in love. It's a story about resilience, about refusing to give up when life knocks you down, about having the courage to take a second chance when the first one fails you. It's a story about promises kept and love earned and the building of something that lasts long after you're gone. 2 weeks ago, we had a family reunion at Broken Creek. All 6 living generations in one place. Over 100 people, all of them descended from Nathan and Abigail. Children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren spreading out across that ranch like a living testament to what those 2 people started. And as I stood on that porch where they used to sit in their rocking chairs, watching all those faces and hearing all that laughter, I thought about the girl on the train platform, the one who stood straight even when the world was telling her to break, the one who had 62 cents and a worthless piece of paper and more courage than she knew. I thought about how close we all came to never existing if she'd gotten back on that train, if she'd given up, if she hadn't been gathering herbs by Broken Creek the day Nathan fell, if she'd walked past him, if she'd left him to die. But she didn't. She saved him. And in saving him, she saved all of us who came after. Some legacies are measured in years. Nathan and Abigail's is measured in generations. In love that didn't die when they did, but kept growing, kept spreading, kept creating new life and new hope. And every fall, when someone in this family makes apple butter from Abigail's recipe, when that smell fills whatever kitchen they're in, we remember. We remember where we came from. We remember what love looks like when it's real and tested and true. We remember that the best things in life aren't given. They're earned, one day at a time, one choice at a time, one promise kept at a time. That's the legacy. That's what lasts. And friend, if you're listening to this story and thinking about your own life, about the promises you've made, or the chances you've taken, or the loves you've lost, I want you to know something. It's never too late. It's never too late to keep a promise. Never too late to try again. Never too late to choose love over fear, hope over despair, tomorrow over yesterday. Abigail Winters stepped off that train with nothing and built a legacy that's lasted 140 years and counting. She did it with dignity and hard work and a man who saw her worth when she couldn't see it herself. You can too. Whatever train platform you're standing on, whatever broken promises you're carrying, Whatever fear is keeping you frozen, take the step, do the work, keep your promises, love with everything you have, and trust that somewhere down the line, people you'll never meet will be grateful you did. That's the story. That's the legacy. That's what matters in the end. May you build something half as lasting. May you love someone half as well. May your legacy be measured not in what you gained, but in what you gave. And may your apple butter always turn out sweet.